Hello and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab talk. I'm Sarah Wallace and I'm the director of the Open Documentary Lab. And today I'm pleased to introduce Caroline Sinders. Caroline is a machine learning design researcher and artist. For the past few years, she's been examining the intersections of natural language processing, artificial intelligence, abuse, online harassment, and politics in digital conversational spaces. She's the founder of Convocation Design and Research, an agency focusing on the intersections of machine learning, user research, designing for public good, and solving difficult communication problems. As a designer and researcher, she has worked for Amnesty International, Intel, IBM Watson, the Wikimedia Foundation, and a lot of other places. She's currently a fellow with Ars Electronica AI Lab with the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and also a visiting fellow with the Weizenbaum Institute looking at labor and systems in AI and platforms. She has held fellowships with the Harvard Kennedy School, Mozilla Foundation, Pioneer Works, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, IBEAM, Studio for Creative Inquiry, and the International Center of Photography. Her work's been featured at the Tate Exchange and Tate Modern, Victoria and Albert Museum, MoMA PS1, the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, Slate, Quartz, and the Channels Festival, as well as many other places. She holds a master's from New York University's Interactive Telecommunications program, and I know her because she has developed a feminist data set, which we'll hear about. Before I hand it over to her, I wanted to say that the talk will be about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions both from our respondents and from you. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get to it. So today, Caroline's going to talk about her research-driven art process, as well as her feminist data set and a lot of other interventions, and I will hand it over to her. So thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. So thank you for the invitation, Sarah. I'm a big fan of the Open Doc Lab, so it's really nice to be engaging in conversation with all of you. I'm really excited to share my work with you, especially because I have combined two presentations. So first, we're going to run through one that is called Creating Research-Driven Art, and then jump into a new one that I just made yesterday called Emotional Malware. And yeah, I'm really excited to get your thoughts and feedback and engage in a discussion. And I'm just gonna start. Great, okay. And I'm guessing y'all can see my screen. So anyway, let's dive into creating research-driven art. Oops, sorry. So as Sarah said, hi, I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher, and I work at the intersections of civil society and the private sector, looking at the impacts of technology in society and its effects on marginalized groups. So this is probably the most high-level way to describe my work. I've held residencies with BuzzFeed and IBM, Pioneer Works, Mozilla, Harvard, and I currently sit on a working group with the United Nations on data privacy and children. And I'm also an artist with Ars Electronica's AI Lab and a visiting researcher with the Weizenbaum Institute. Probably what's important to know is before I got my master's, I worked as a photojournalist, as a photographer, and I have my undergrad degrees in photography and imaging. So my background really is in photojournalism, research, design, and art. And I see everything through the lens of legibility and research storytelling, which are skills I honed as a photojournalist. And with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research, again, focusing through the lens of how design and technology affects people in their everyday lives. And research-driven art is how I define my own personal practice. So it's art that is shaped and driven by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. I don't make data visualization, but I could. But the way I like to think about my art is, imagine if you made something like net art or technology-based art, but with the same principles as photojournalism. So like photojournalism, my research-driven art methodology uses specific structures and a sense of purpose to constrain it. These constraints work much like the way a skeleton works. While they stabilize the practice just as a rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice, nor do they keep it from moving and flexing on its own. So in this way, the research I do stabilizes and shapes my art and my art practice, but it doesn't dictate the outcome, which leaves me with a lot of freedom to sort of create any kind of outcome. My work isn't necessarily artifact driven, but it can have an output that looks like many different things, from a white paper to a workshop to an artistic sculpture to a room-sized takeover, or even creating a conference or a festival. In late May, after the United States erupted in protest for Black Lives Matter and after George Floyd's death, I saw a number of curators and critics remarking on social media and social networks about tech artists, read, white and male, and their roles specifically in unpacking technology, injustice, and activism. And this inspired me to write an article called In Defense of Usefulness. For this article over email, the curator and writer Nora Khan discussed artistic practices during moments of cultural upheaval. Khan wrote, "How might critical technology work be called on in this moment to do more? Coded design work has that capacity. Hybrid research practices can explain and expose the logics of racial capitalism, but under the auspices of artistic collaboration, which can enact critique, make an argument through process, and through a built system," end quote. So this idea of usefulness and interdisciplinary work is key, and is a key and necessary part of a research-driven arts practice. And the practice, my practice, is directly extremely inspired by Tania Bruguera's arte utile methodology, which translates to utilitarian art. Arte utile draws on artistic thinking to imagine, create, and implement tactics that change how we act in society, again, heavily focused on usefulness, on tool building, and on communities. Khan highlighted the strength of work stretching across domain, which makes art a necessary Trojan horse to discuss useful change. Personally, this is where I turn to the work of American artists Francis Singh, Joanna Mull, Adam Harvey, Mimi Onawa, forensic architecture, and others. These artists are pulling from research or investigatory-based practices, and with work that then manifests into a variety of outputs, artifacts, writings, and education. The practices of American artists, or the anonymous group behind ScanMap, are great examples of social justice and human rights-driven art. With ScanMap's current work on tracking police scanners across a website, or American artists' work, If I'm Blue, If I Was Blank, I Would Die, and My Blue Window, two pieces that comment on the structure and violence of modern police forces. Other examples of social justice research and artistic practices are the works like Hidden Life of an Amazon User by Joanna Mull, or Adam Harvey's V-Frame research, which came out of his numerous collaborations with the human rights archiving group, the Syrian Archive, or generally the investigative work of forensic architecture. One example of a research and social justice-based art practice is Mimi Onawa's. Onawa's research work, like on the politics and injustices of dataset, have resulted in artworks like the Library of Missing Datasets and the widely cited and canonical zine and educational tool, The People's Guide to AI, co-written with Diana J. Nucera. These pieces and artists occupy a liminal space of research, journalism, and art. And these aforementioned works could be viewed solely as art or as research, but are much more richly seen when viewed as research-based artistic activist practices. And in this context, design and art are the same for me. And while this is a wordy description, it rings true to the intentions of the works. The works aren't just to bear witness, though that alone would be worthwhile. They question, provocate, and offer a solution to a problem. This should not be viewed as a form of techno-solutionism, however. The solutions the artists provide are not meant to create an end-all be-all to other potential solutions, but rather serve to offer temporary or open source fixes for gaps in inequity and violence created by society, and thus are poetic witnesses to those gaps. This kind of Band-Aid is in a similar space where I pursue my own practice. Band-Aids exist as necessary provocations or patches, while participatory design and deconstruction, and artists and human rights researchers and activists and technologists and communities together can overhaul the system or destroy systems together. The togetherness and collaboration is key, though. But nonetheless, provocations within art and design can create imaginaries for new realities. I'd like to quickly show you some projects and explain where they came from. One art project, Social Media Breakup Coordinator, has come out of my nearly 8 years of studying online harassment and how the design of systems can create harassment. I look at the affordances of technology. Do UX and UI decisions mitigate harassment, and can they amplify it? I think they can. Think about it. If you were being harassed, what does the system allow you to do? What can you do to create safety in that space? And what can you do to be safe? Some of my research focuses on harassment of everyday users and then journalists who can face really large threats like governmental censorship or surveillance, all the way to more regular drive-by harassment or harassment campaigns. This research has been supported by different organizations like Harvard and the Open Technology Fund. And within this research, it also inspires art. Social Media Breakup Coordinator comes out of the space of research, of spending a lot of time studying how content moves online and what we can do to react to it or to stop it. Or in the case of harassment, how people relate to being online. How do we as a society respond to being online in these really structured and designed spaces? What are the new kinds of anxieties and tension that come up? For a lot of victims, for example, regardless of technical background or job, I mean, this is something I hear journalists say a lot, they feel like they shouldn't be upset by what is said to them online. But you should be. It's okay to be hurt and affected by someone calling you dumb or sending you a rape threat. It's supposed to hurt. So as a researcher, I look at these anxieties, and as an artist, I create explorations or interventions around them. Social Media Breakup Coordinator is a performance piece that explores the very intertwined and interconnections of our offline and online lives. The piece has gone through 3 iterations since 2015. I'm exploring the connections between our digital tools and human intervention. Where do algorithms fail and humans must intervene? As users of social media, people live their most beautiful, angry, complex, and complicated lives online. And I'm exploring a series of solutions following a breakup with social media and how to coordinate a la a therapist or social media coordinator, and sort of viewing this breakup the way a social media coordinator would work with an ad agency for one social media account, following this messy decoupling of algorithmic combinations that intersect into people's daily lives. So similar to an algorithm, I'm creating a series of solutions that can be combined for a variety of situations, perhaps following friendship breakups, ending abusive relationships, an awkward coworker friending you, and a myriad of others. Every participant sitting with me as the coordinator signs a legally binding document drafted by my collaborator, Fred Jennings, who is a lawyer. This outlines that I am not a therapist and cannot be held liable for damages. Then users fill out a 21-point user quiz where I prescribe answers out of an algorithm I hand wrote with less than 40 suggestions. These suggestions are puzzle pieced together, which leaves the user feeling like they are receiving highly personal advice, when in fact it is algorithmically generated. Social Media Coordinator is also a comment on the US's lack of healthcare and mental health support, as well as the growing gig economy. Because in this project, I'm effectively a gig economy therapist, as well as a digital security trainer and advice giver. So for a few dollars in 15 minutes, people fill out a survey and I give them real feedback. It started as a kind of algorithmic feedback, me mimicking a real life chatbot, but it's now just turned into short feedback sessions. And the feedback and questions and interactions pull from my very real research of seeing how the general anxieties people have about being online. It's also exploring this idea of expendable help and how anxiety about the internet isn't really taken seriously, even though it should be. And through this, I've created a series of public data sets about these anxieties. In February 2019, I took over Baby Castles to host an entire month of Social Media Breakup Coordinator with new artwork, a video game arcade, and weekly talks featuring Fei Liu, Pamela Liu, Jacqueline Maybe, Charles Bukowski, Molly Soda, as well as others. Video games that were installed were Wrong Box by Molly, Soda, and Aquam, Museum of the Moving Image by Flan, Yet Another Exhausted Day by Candleman Games, Attack of the Terms and Conditions by Mace 486, Wonders of the Internet by Let Off Studios, and Valentine Doom by David Ugg and Sub-Zero. The games themselves, combined with the talks and performances, were all mediations on the problems and anxieties within social media. We created a moving algorithm projected on a wall, inspired by our workshops at the very end of the exhibit, while still holding social media breakup coordinator sessions. What you see here is Lauren Gardner, one of the curators, exploring the algorithm we created during the 3 weeks on the social media breakup data. I also curated a series of posters on disconnecting with technology and social media from artists and researchers like Siddhat Harry, Merritt Kay, Helen Shewolf Singh, Salomia Siga, and myself. And this is me in session at Baby Castles. And later in December 2019, I won a web residency with Academy/Solitude, and I created a critical design chatbot with Alex Fifagea. The bot is designed to respond to questions and care for victims, as well as be a series of open source best practices and guides and what to do in facing a variety of online harassment. This bot is an extension of Social Media Breakup Coordinator. This bot also tells the user that it shouldn't exist, but it does to fill a void created by social media platforms. That the help and feedback the bot is providing should actually be handled by real people and trained professionals on these platforms, but that doesn't exist. Until that kind of help infrastructure exists, the bot will exist instead. So my work likes to play with this line of being useful, but also highlighting deeper issues at play. Another project I worked on was Higher Resolutions with Hyphen Labs as the lead artist for the Tate Exchange at the Tate Modern. Higher Resolution ran for 2 weeks in 2019 and used interactive art, talks from international technology experts, and hand-on workshops to examine the state of power and privacy online, from widespread surveillance to how AI is shaping culture and relationships, to threats from emerging technology that can pose to human rights. Artists and speakers hailed from organizations like Amnesty International, Change.org, the BBC, the Carnegie Trust, and other international organizations. A major reason I was so excited to work with Hyphen Labs was the ability to bring in policy researchers, political activists, and watchdog groups directly into our artistic collaboration. It's important when creating activist and social justice work as artists to avoid replicating unintentional work done by activists out in the field. Instead, we can work directly with those activists. When fighting data surveillance, the way to create change is to work together and create levers of pressure in the public, and the arts institutions are a necessary part of that lever and necessary part of the public. We need to avoid creating art alone only in the space of art, and we should seek collaboration with other activists and researchers who are working on identical causes. The 2 weeks of programming unfolded in unique physical spaces designed to mimic the different layers of privacy we toggle with between the online, as well as we created a floor schematic highlighting privacy concerns in our daily lives. These metaphors are metaphors I've used in my own work to try to describe that privacy is not necessarily a binary between the public and the private, but it is a series of different kinds of steps. The metaphors are town hall, being an analog of Twitter, which is the most public, the park bench, an analog of Facebook, which is the semi-public, which you see here. So for example, you really can't look at a lot of content on Facebook unless you're signed in. People have varying levels of privacy settings. So unlike Twitter, everything is private or public. Facebook is this more semi-public space. So much like a park, which is technically infrastructurally public, you have to walk around the park and you can maybe happenstantially overhear people's conversations. But unlike a town hall where everyone or anyone can speak and a lot of people can hear it amplified, it's not necessarily the same when you're engaging in a conversation in a park. Then we have the living room, which is the semi-private, which is an analog of WhatsApp. And then the loo, or the bedroom, which is an analog of really intimate text conversation. So that's being the most intimate. So we install these physical sculptures in this space to sort of highlight these varying levels of intimacy. And then we had specific workshops in those spaces that also correlated to different levels of intimacy. So smaller workshops were in the living room. public talks were in the town hall. There were also art installations that spotlight the perils of modern technology like facial recognition, website tracking, and harmful content recommendations. The following images display a participant voting on a feature to ban. And so we called Stop That Feature, Stop That Future. Also Tear Off Truisms, inspired a little bit by Jenny Holzer, describing surveillance capitalism. The goal of this project was to bring conversations of privacy with policymakers into the white cube space to transform these conversations and make them more actionable and tangible for museum goers. How often does a lead of an advocacy campaign get to face-to-face engage with people who sign their campaigns, or even engage with arts organizers? I'm just gonna take a quick sip of water. Another example of research-driven social justice art project is Feminist Dataset, which started in 2017 as a response to the many documented cases of problems in technology and bias in machine learning. It's a critical research and art project that examines bias in machine learning through the machine learning pipeline, such as data collection, data training, neural networks, and then exploring new forms of user interface, as well as the projected creation of a feminist artificial intelligence system. The project is inspired by the work of the maker movement, critical design, arte utile, the critical engineering manifesto, xenofeminism, and the feminist principles of the internet. Feminist Dataset is a multi-year project that uses intersectional feminism as a framework for investigating machine learning. It's trans-inclusive and focuses on racial justice. It's extremely process-driven, so the outputs of the project or the artifacts are workshops on data and machine learning. The workshops here are key since they are a mechanism to think through what community-driven, equitable data collection could look like. In workshops, we discuss what is intersectional data, what does it mean? We talk about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work, the creator of the term intersectionality. But we also unpack intersectional feminism in writing, since writing is the form of data that we're collecting, which can be blog posts, articles, poems, song lyrics, etc. So what is intersectional feminism in writing in practice? Let's look at it. Let's look at an example about income inequality. So an intersectional feminist article would highlight that white women, Black women, Indigenous women, Latina women, and Latinx women, and trans folks of different races are all paid different amounts. So an article that simply represents all women as a monolith is not intersectional and cannot be included in the data set. Within our workshops, community members then research and submit this written data, be it poems, texts, blogs, transcripts, whatever. The only time my hand as a curator appears is to remove non-intersectional data, and I'm extremely firm about this. Racists and TERFs need not apply. Feminist Dataset operates in a similar vein to Thomas Twait's toaster project, which you see here. A critical design project in which Twaits builds a commercial toaster from scratch, from melting iron ore to building circuits and creating a new plastic toaster body mold. Feminist Dataset, however, takes a critical and artistic view on software, particularly on machine learning. What does it mean to thoughtfully make with machine learning, to carefully consider every angle of making, iterating, and designing? Every step of this process needs to be thoroughly re-examined through a feminist lens, and like Twait's toaster, every step has to work. What I like about Twait's toaster as an example is because I'm collecting so many different kinds of data, my data model, my algorithmic model will probably be as misshapen as the toaster you see here. So what makes Feminist Dataset an interesting research project, but fundamentally an art project, is I'm okay with the misshapenness of it. If I were trying to build a more accurate model, I would choose one kind of data type, meaning I would choose novels, academic articles, or journalistic articles. A poem, a novel, a white paper, or a journalistic article, they all have a structure and a specificity to them. And to create a more accurate model, I would have to select one of those and train on that. But what I'm not worried about is the accuracy of the sentence structure, but more, again, this political ideology and how that can be reflected in writing. And can that be reflected in something like a data model or like aspects of machine learning? So here's an image from when Feminist Dataset was installed in the Victoria and Albert Museum in the Artificially Intelligent exhibit. My current project, named TRK, or Technically Responsible Knowledge, is an open source project that examines wage inequality and creates open source alternatives to data labeling and training in AI, and it is a part of the Feminist Dataset project. So now the project is focusing on data labeling and the systemic issues around labor, invisibility, and the creation of maintaining data structures and training data algorithmic models. TRK was funded by the Mozilla Foundation and was created with Kay Diem, Ian Arnaud-Fuma, and Rainbow Unicorn. Over 2019, I interviewed research labs, artists, and startups who use Mechanical Turk style services and microservice workers across platforms like Crowdflower, Fiverr, and Mechanical Turk. I even became a Mechanical Turker myself for a few weeks. TRK is an alternative open source tool for dataset training and labeling, which is a time-consuming but integral aspect of machine learning that must be completed in part by a human. The tool offers a wage calculator that helps visualize a livable wage to those that will then be responsible for completing the tasks. As an artist who uses AI as a material to explore and make art, I was struck by how many startups, research labs, and artists use Mechanical Turk style platforms without any thought really given to the payment structure to determine for those workers on the network. Mechanical Turk and similar platforms have had well-documented cases of horrendous worker-related issues, such as severely underpaid contracts. In many instances, even if a lab or individual is trying to price equitably, the interface of Mechanical Turk works against it. If the machine learning pipeline is death by 1,000 cuts, then think of TRK as one Band-Aid for one small cut. The project doesn't propose a solution for all issues related to machine learning, or even a major one for Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So many issues related to machine learning are issues related to a deeper, more ingrained, or of a deeper, more ingrained societal inequity, which can only be addressed through large shifts and restructuring in society or legislation. But within that, as a designer and researcher, I try to look at what kinds of research or work can help alleviate and expose those issues. TRK focuses on how, through pricing structures, platform incentives, and the invisible nature of gig work, clients underprice, undervalue, and fundamentally misunderstand how tasks are handled in these human as a service platforms. Part of the design thinking behind TRK is to examine equity and transparency within interfaces and the design of tools, and what kinds of problems tool design, UX, and UI can create in technology. Inspired by the Data Sheets for Datasets white paper, TRK injects plain text information into the dataset with information that includes a description of what the dataset is and when it was made. UX, or user experience design, is a utilitarian intelligence, focusing on architectural layouts, usability, and user flows. But design has a politics to it. It can suppress or uplift content. Design, much like technology, isn't neutral. As an artist, I use design as a material to confront and comment on the slickness and inequity of for-profit technologies. Very similar to arte utile in a sense, I'm an artist that deals with trauma and the trauma and violence of others. Sometimes the tools I use don't quite work well. So what if I can make them better? An interface is useful and expressive. I say this to you from Berlin, and I think most of you are based in the US, but I've noticed culturally how the United States relates to design as an artistic medium versus Europe, and how design is not necessarily viewed as an artistic practice in the US. I am encouraged to reflect back on critical design, the methodology of removing capitalism from the structure of design. Design can be a tool, much like technology and much like art, to create political and small acts of resistance and change. What kinds of design can we make when we stop viewing it through a Western Silicon Valley neoliberal and capitalist lens? We've seen code and art made without the constraints of capitalism. It's time for design to do that. Critical design, social justice, and design justice are needed now more than ever for tool making, for design to confront how it's perpetuated white supremacy and change its relationships to power. Design can be an actuator for change, but design alone is not an entire solution towards injustice in society and technology. Design can confront a problem while acknowledging that it's a part of the problem. Design can help visualize or highlight parts of systemic injustice, but design must unpack and confront its role in contributing to injustice in technology, especially technology in Silicon Valley. I use design as an artistic practice and as a lever to create the usefulness to explore problem solving. Similarly, how anonymous programmers and artists created ScanMap to provide a solution for surveilling the police, and Everest Pimpkin's tool to blur images for people to use at protests, design can sit in a space to solve small problems that are a part of bigger spaces and issues. My approach to design thinking proposes a decommodification of art and situates it as a process and investigation. Artistic approaches to problem allow for collaborations that might not happen in other fields. And in this way, art's role in social justice and human rights makes space for new kinds of work in a way that other fields traditionally could not let those projects exist. What does change look like? It has to be interdisciplinary across many fields of art, activism, policy, and social justice working together and not necessarily separately. So that is the end of my research-driven art talk. I'm gonna jump into this new talk I made, which is on memes. Oh, and I realized these slides may have formatted differently because one is longer than the other. Actually, I may just switch really quickly to the next, to a new presentation so you don't see it looking weird. I guess while I'm doing that, does anyone have any really pertinent or burning questions? If not, I can keep going.
No questions yet in the Q&A, so I think we can keep going. Thanks.
Awesome.
If you do have questions, remember to put them in the Q&A.
Great. Okay. So this other talk called Emotional Malware, which is on memes and misinformation, disinformation. So hi, this is me. So when I'm engaging in really complex and long-term research work, I still fold design into it, even if the design artifacts are never published. So one thing I'm constantly doing is sort of sketching and drawing and creating small graphs for myself. And this is important to highlight because for me, design and art can really serve as explorative avenues of way finding and path making, particularly in research, and especially for me in unpacking memes, algorithms, and social networks. This is not an exhaustive talk, and this is supposed to be more like a 15-minute talk, so it's only going to scratch the surface. So I would say view this the way you would view a shorter term article or a 30-minute episode that's a part of a longer documentary series. So let's dive in. While I was a fellow with IBEAM in 2016, I had been researching at this point, I had been researching online harassment for about 3 years. This is 2016. And while I had been researching online harassment and social networks, I had been studying harassment campaigns and groups like Gamergate. So I spent a lot of time on websites like 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, Vote, and Twitter, and really just reading a lot of really, really awful harassing content across these sites. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but I was actually also tracking and following the beginnings of the alt-right. And then my fellowship started in 2016 with IBEAM, and right after the US presidential election, the spaces that I was studying, so Reddit, Twitter, 4chan, 8chan, they really shifted in a way after the election. And it was like Gamergate just immediately kind of left the room. Even though Gamergate still had a subreddit, a lot of the conversations that people were having were just overtaken by the election. And this is true, I think, of US society, that right before, during, and after the election, a lot of our conversations were about the election and dealing with a Trump presidency. Regardless of one's opinions, if it's positive or negative, I think it's very negative, he's our president. It just sort of overtook everyone's conversations in this very real way. So I started studying the alt-right then. And in 2017, I made this graph to help situate myself. And at this point, I had been exclusively researching the alt-right for about 6 months, so I'd shifted away from Gamergate. And I was consulting with researchers at the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an initiative in the US that studies hate speech and tracks hate groups. Oops, sorry, I'm gonna start this again because I couldn't see I still can't see my mouse. That's weird. Here we go. Okay, great. So what's important to know about these circles is that they're not drawn to any kind of numerical scale. The first time I showed these, someone came up to me and they were like, "Oh, is this from Twitter? Like, how did you scrape this data?" And I'm like, "No, it's not from Twitter." So the circles refer to the size of the idea. So the size of the alt-right circle doesn't correlate to the amount of tweets I've scraped, but the size of the idea and how many other ideas it can encompass. So it's supposed to show that the alt-right's this really, really, really broad ideology, and it houses a lot of other more specific ideologies. Now, a big thing that comes out of this is this technically data? And it's not. It is and it's not. So if a journalist were to ask me if you could publish this, I'd have a really hard time saying yes, unless it was an op-ed piece. But this is just a sketch of data that I was looking at, of more qualitative data. It's a snapshot in time of conversations that were unfolding in terms of what I was reading on social networks. If anything, even if it feels a little clinical and very clean, it's much more of a research-driven art piece that is just trying to document the time we were in early 2017. And with this ideology, you do see a scale. So now we've zoomed in a little bit. The lineup goes from white nationalist to ex-military. And this is the scale of severity and hate ideology. And one that I worked through and determined with a Southern Poverty Law Center researcher. So in the Southern Poverty Law Center, they do view ex-military anti-government militias as this very, very serious and more extreme group. But yeah, so this is kind of what it looks like. And I'm hoping to actually update these for an art show that I'm working on soon to actually show all the differences, because I do think that this graph would be really different now. I think the alt-right would totally be removed because we don't really use the term alt-right anymore. The alt-right isn't something we necessarily talk about, but we do talk about a lot more openly now about white supremacy and about white nationalism. Those terms are terms we use so much more now. And I made this other graph in 2017 as a hypothesis of the future. This is based off this digital ethnographic work I was doing and looking at the ironic nature of digital speech, 4chan, and Reddit. What would feel a bit more now, and this hypothesis was focusing on the idea of context collapse and how all of these overlapping terms may end up meaning the same thing. And we saw them starting to get used interchangeably, but we see them used interchangeably now. And what's sort of important to highlight is these are specific political ideologies, but the ideologies feel blurrier now. Things feel a little bit more extreme. It feels like white supremacy and neo-Nazism are much closer than they used to be. The graph now would be this, with this bar crossing out the alt-right, because the alt-right, again, really doesn't exist anymore. It's not so much an alternative, but now it's an established norm, and the groups are even further right. So an updated graph should probably have the alt-right entirely removed. Really briefly, you'll just see all the graphs installed. They were installed as transparencies. I won't stay on the slide very long because there is audio. It usually doesn't play with audio, but for some reason it's been playing now with this background audio. So anyway, we can just sort of look at them like this. So these posters were then printed as transparencies. And one of the reasons I wanted to print them as transparencies, and they were installed in a gallery in Oakland, California, is I was interested in sort of visualizing the amount of noise I was looking at. And as you turn and walk around and look at the transparencies through a side angle, it's much easier to read them. And that serves as this metaphor for how I do my own kind of research, that once I divide things into smaller slices, it's much more easier to equate myself with the data that I'm looking at. So defining emotional malware. So I've been using these graphs as artistic means to unpack research and ideas within the context of my work. And I view them in relationship to this descriptor of emotional malware, which is related to how people create and share content within the digital commons. So Clay Shirky wrote in his seminal book in 2008, Here Comes Everybody, on the new formation of the public commons inside of the internet. The term "here comes everybody" specifically was a provocative emphasis of what the internet does well in terms of organizing. It allows people as singular entities with no institutional affiliation to organize and create new spaces of organization. In essence, to create new modes and meanings of what an organization could mean and could be defined as in a digital space. To organize doesn't mean having anything rooted to physicality. Ideas could manifest, fester, grow, and replicate inside of software spaces. Ideas and conversations could be the reason for organizing in the nexus of communities. A tweet can start a space of a large-scale conversation. That conversation doesn't need to be housed in a body or a cafeteria or a meeting hall or any physical structure. It's now housed in the open internet or the digital commons. But in this era of misinformation and disinformation, of rising populism, of online harassment, of mistrust, of general regular conflict, and of surveillance, what kinds of conversations exist inside the commons now? When and how do the commons serve us? When there's all this emotionally fraught information that is then sort of served up again through machine learning? What do transparency and clarity look like when our conversations are conflict-ridden and confusing, and the opaque systems are serving users nonlinear conversations through algorithmic intervention? So in an essay written in 2017, I coined this term called emotional malware as a way to define some aspects and folds of fake news. Emotional malware is a form of digitally and targeted propaganda designed to work effectively within social networks and to play upon our emotions. So emotional malware and fake news fits into the political turmoil by sliding into a space that feeds upon consumers' emotions. It's activated propaganda with all the designs and imitations to mimic a trustworthy source. In essence, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. What you're seeing here are screenshots from a Washington Post article on Gamergate published in 2014, and a Gamergate meme highlighting that Gamergate is related to free speech and sort of drawing upon this emotion, and creating this emotional malware that Gamergate, the harassment campaign, was actually a fight for free speech. I want to quickly revise this definition of emotional malware slightly to include unintentional harms that still have large consequences, so that emotional malware may also be unintentional but emotional propaganda. Maybe it's something like a meme that isn't designed from the onset to hurt, but it does manifest into that. I think it's important to think about and define intentionally and targeted and harmful memes, which are forms of content we also see in harassment campaigns, and we saw this so frequently inside of Gamergate. Memes and general content that are designed to hurt people and designed to misconstrue are also a form of emotional malware. So this style of intentional harm was heavily prevalent, as I've mentioned, during Gamergate, which included posts such as victims having their faces photoshopped into different images of porn, or other victims who were photoshopped to look like they were engaging in violence. This led to very dangerous situations. Generally, so we see a lot of forms of emotional malware manifesting in harassment or also in forms of misinformation. Over Twitter DM, the author and researcher Whitney Phillips and I talked about misinformation and harm. We actually spoke a few days ago for this presentation. Phillips uses terms like weaponized memes or polluted information, which cover a multitude of deliberate and inadvertent harms. Harm here is important, since content that might not have been intended to be harmful or harassing can be used to harm and harass. The consequences are what matter more than what the meme was initially created to be or do. Weaponized memes gives us this framing that allows for memes that were not intentionally harmful or harassing, like Pepe, but then become weaponized. Phillips emphasizes that rhetoric and research should be used and focused on the impact of content rather than the intention of content, and so that the outcome and the ripple effects of harm are centered. And so related to this is language. Language matters. Naming an action can help make it more real. I'm coming at this from a specific angle of online harassment, where naming harassment can help situate that harassment in reality. By naming an action like doxing, which is a form of harassment in which is described as the release of public documents. So releasing someone's phone number or credit card number or email or social security number. Suddenly that action, when it's named like doxing, can be documented, tracked, and understood. Doxing is now almost a part of every major platform and website's terms of service as an action to not engage in on that platform. So now it's actually a part of policy to not do it. Language gives truth to power. So within that context, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of naming, deciphering, and describing things in relationship to misinformation and disinformation. And so what you see here is a graph I made in 2016 to unpack and explain trolling and harassment for Fusion News. This graph was made in response to the misuse of the word trolling, especially by harassers and members of Gamergate. This misuse of purposely naming every action from the humorous to the harassing as a form of trolling flattened and minimized the harmful actions that were included under this umbrella term. Trolling is applied to so many different types of actions now that's better to think of it as a taxonomy rather than a word with a singular definition. So it encompasses a range of varying actions, identities, and events that span from the humorously annoying to the dangerous. And so by expanding this or creating this taxonomy, we can more accurately name what is trolling and then also what is harmful. A particular troll is charted in the matrix based off the legality of that behavior, how hard it is to fix the effects, the American Western cultural and taboos, the emotional weight for the harassed victim, and the societal or personal power of both the troll and the person who is trolled or harassed. The word troll describes a digital subculture, one that combines an irreverent sense of humor with a kind of abuse. So here are examples of some trolling out in the wild. For example, pollsters trolled voters by asking them in 2015 or 2016 if the US should bomb Agrabah, which is the home of Disney's Aladdin. So 30% of GOP voters and 19% of Democratic voters who were polled said yes, which completed the joke about this being political ignorance. But the word is also used for activities that have serious emotional and legal ramifications. We can use trolling to describe anonymous sending pizzas to Scientologists, which is a more casual form of trolling, but trolling also gets used to describe someone tweeting that they hope someone gets raped, and that is obviously very harmful. Humor is not the same as abuse, but calling them both trolling falsely equivocates them and links them together. So I want to apologize for this graph. I threw it together to show what something should look like now. So this graph should be a living document, and I've crudely updated it for this talk. So in this current graph, this current graph represents the harms of now, because what needs to be addressed within this is also what changes, which is the action, which is power. Actions and harms are not if-then statements, and events are not done in isolation. Power changes the context of an action. So when I first made this graph, Trump was a presidential candidate and was not considered a serious presidential candidate. Trump now is president of the United States. So even him saying something that could be viewed as sort of childish bullying about a particular person or event is actually extremely harmful given the context of who he is and the platforms he has access to. So power in a person's platform changes the level of harm. Changes the level of harm in regards to a piece of content, post, or even an event. And I'll be jumping between phrases and years to illustrate how context and aesthetics affect our understanding of content, and how aesthetics and context and content are related to power. Because power changes context. In political science, there is a theory that situates the far left and the far right are much closer to each other, as opposed to being very diametrically opposed opposites. This theory is called horseshoe theory. I don't believe this theory, and I'm going to unpack why in a second. This theory was created by Jean-Pierre Fay, but I find this to be a theory of creating false equivalencies. I bring it up here to illustrate a point of harm, to illustrate the points of harm, context, and content. Horseshoe theory assumes all extreme actions are equal or are more closely related, but this inherently flattens the work that social justice is engaging in, and it misconstrues when anger is necessary. For example, my belief in COVID being real and my anger perhaps in those not taking it seriously is not the same as my mother's friend who believes vaccines will hurt her. Her sharing memes on Facebook saying COVID isn't real is not an opinion, nor is my anger towards her not us getting along, because her memes are medical misinformation that can harm someone. I want to briefly reference the title of Sarah Schulman's book because the title is so helpful in explaining this form of conflict. Conflict is not abuse, and not all anger is the same. Anger at injustice is different than anger at the demands of the continuation of injustice. To reference Whitney Phillips again, she says it best in an article she wrote for the Boston Review on cancel culture. She writes, in other words, it is not just that their actions aren't equivalent, they also aren't treated equally. The anger of those seeking justice, especially those who are Black, brown, female, or members of minority groups, is minimized, pathologized, and knee-jerk condemned. By contrast, the anger of those enacting injustice against those very bodies, who tend to be white, frequently male, and members of dominant groups, is taken seriously and placed into a context and very often have a granted path towards redemption, end quote. But some of the events that I've described to you and that I've already shown you could be argued as more easily recognizable as harmful. Within that taxonomy, you saw events and content that were very clearly toxic, bullying, and harassment. But what about innocuous events? And how can aesthetic choices render social media content to feel harmless, or even make content feel engaging? A current form of emotional malware is QAnon's Save the Children posts, which have been appearing in millennial Instagram influencer mom accounts. This was widely reported on in August 2020 by The Atlantic of this convergence of the millennial aesthetic combined with QAnon hashtags. QAnon is a far-right conspiracy group that used to be much more on the fringes of the internet. The Guardian describes it as a baseless internet conspiracy theory whose followers believe that a cabal of Satan-worshipping Democrats, Hollywood celebrities, and billionaires run the world while engaging in pedophilia, human trafficking, and the harvesting of a supposedly life-extending chemical from the blood of abused children. QAnon believes that Donald Trump is waging a secret battle against this cabal and its deep state collaborators to expose the malefactors and send them all to Guantanamo Bay. What you see here in this slide are 3 different white mom influencer accounts off Instagram. We're looking at Jalen Schroeder with 55,000 followers, Chiara Chanel Self with 31,000 followers, and Lana Michelle with 86,000 followers. But how did this converge with millennial moms on Instagram? Through the hashtag of Save the Children. This kind of conversion and supporting, calling out Save the Children is peak emotional malware. The aesthetics are pleasing. They fit into a slickness of the real internet, not this dark corner that we tend to think of with conspiracy theories. Like a thanks ad or an acne bag or a popular repinned post on Pinterest, this little square feels different than the fervent, chaotic posts associated with conspiracy theorists. This is design and it looks good, with a basic feel-good call to action almost anyone could agree with. After all, who wouldn't want to save the children with white text on top of blush hues? Aesthetics and memes create norms, and they help shape what we view as legitimate content. Extremely zoomed out, it seems like these millennial mom aesthetics should be in either of these 2 quadrants, maybe the casual and the absurd, or the serious and the absurd, but definitely not into the harmful and serious category. After all, who is harmed? What is really the harm being performed by caring about human trafficking in comparison to death threats, or in comparison to caring about Facebook groups like Kenosha Guard, which had a call to arms event, which resulted in Kyle Rittenhouse shooting multiple protesters and murdering 2 people? That very clearly is harmful and serious. I mean, that post was asking people to arm up with weapons, and another one is just misguided moms. and their moms concerned with human trafficking. We lack the time now, but it is really worth getting into that actually these statistics and conversations around human trafficking are widely inflated, is a major form of misinformation and disinformation. It's actually an anomaly. So few children are actually human trafficked in the way that QAnon says that they are. But that is another time for another presentation. So holding into that, let's zoom in a little bit. It's really not a far cry or step or far away step from the kinds of awareness raised to these moms to the actual harmful, which would be something like Pizzagate. Because both of these stem from QAnon conspiracy theories, and they're the same theories that resulted in Pizzagate, with an armed man storming a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., looking for missing and abducted children. Taylor Lorenz covered in The Atlantic in 2019 that Instagram will soon be the next battle for misinformation. Pinterest as well, with its algorithm already sharing and serving up aesthetically soothing anti-vax posts. Well, that was until its engineers rewrote the algorithm to delist and suppress anti-vaccine content. Researcher Rebecca Lewis highlights the specific tension that it's a huge misconception that disinformation and conspiracy theories happen only in fringe spaces or in dark corners of the internet. So much of this content is disseminated by popular accounts with mainstream aesthetics. Perhaps the note to end on is the fact that conspiracy theories, harm, white supremacy, and growing fascism and violence don't happen on the dark corners of the internet. They happen on our clear internet. They happen in the most obvious, large, and innocuous spaces. It's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. What I'm hoping to explore in the next few months is this kind of mainstream aesthetics with a new series of graphs. I really want to deeply explore platforms, power, and people. I wonder if we can ever visualize or graph the platforms themselves and their algorithms as the power giver. These taxonomies I've created show harm, but what about the third dimension, the one that changes everything, which is power? Platforms are responsible, with YouTube serving up content, Instagram creating recommendations. I don't know if these power structures can ever be captured visually as a material in relationship to the harmful content they share up and serve. But perhaps it's just enough to say out loud here with you that people and platforms are responsible to violence, sometimes rendered in the most gentle and banal of aesthetics. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Caroline. Oops. Sorry. Thank you, Caroline. That was really great. Wonderful work. We have several respondents here who have questions for you. Does anyone want to start? Any hands up? Okay, we have Yusuf has a question for you.
Oh, great. Is it in the...
Yusuf, you're on mute.
Thank you. Hi, Caroline. And
Hi.
Thank you for a great presentation. I still remember the project that you presented for the data representation class led by Jet Thorpe. I think the project was called Read Your Tags, which focused on t-shirts. Can you tell us more about that project, the presence of color, its political implications, and the influence of that project in your practice?
The Read Your Tags project?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sure. So for those of you that don't know that project, it was something I made when I was at ITP in my master's program. I was really interested. So I had read a book called Overdressed, which was on the environmental effects of the clothing industry. And I was just really deeply interested in it, of how clothing production had shifted in the past few decades from being like from a fair amount of it being produced in the US to being produced in other parts of the world. So being produced in China, being produced in South America, being produced in the Philippines and Bangladesh and India. And I really wanted to make something about it. I should also highlight, like, I'm not the world's best programmer, so my favorite things to do is create workarounds in relationship to very hardcore technology projects. And so Jared's class had been very, very programming heavy, and I really wanted to flex my muscles as a researcher and as someone who was interested in things like exhibit design. So I learned from this book that, and also through Jared's class, how to like engage in further and further research. So I used the book as a basis to try to figure out who is tracking like where general American clothing is coming from. And so I guess that I should also say, like, I ended up purchasing 100 shirts of different colors and creating a physical bar graph by creating a clothing rack of 100 shirts that people could like they were on hangers people could look at. And then I had on the tags different information about like clothing production, of like how cotton is treated, what were like the environmental effects of just making clothes. But all the colors correlated to clothing that was purchased and imported in, I want to say 2012 in the United States. So I, through this book, started pulling out, trying to craft like, okay, like what is the amount of clothing, like what is the clothing Americans buy in a year and where does it come from, which is actually not a straightforward question at all. So I had to go based off of what had been reported in terms of purchasing during a year and correlate the purchasing amounts with this one group that was monitoring imports of clothing. And then from there I could deduce what was made in the US. So it was not a perfect statistic, but what it came down to was under 2% of clothes that Americans purchased in the year 2012, under 2% were made in the United States. And I think the biggest amounts ended up being like India, China, and Bangladesh. And then I presented this project at around the same time. There's actually a collapse of a series of factories called Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. And I think at that point, like 1,000 people had been injured. I'm not sure how many had been killed. But so I was really interested also in exploring the human rights issues. One thing that was really clear from some of the research, and also that was emphasized by watchdog groups that work within the garment world, is that just because something is made outside the United States, that doesn't mean it's made under harmful conditions. And so some of the actually best and most technologically advanced factories are in China, because they've just held on to like creating factories and producing and moving forward, where like the US actually has closed factories. And so if you wanted to start a line of clothing in the United States, you really couldn't, because we just don't have that factory infrastructure anymore. But anyway, so this project was just me just being really interested in how do you kind of like humanize data. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Great. Any other, Josh?
Yeah, Caroline, thanks so much for presenting your work. And I really love how you visualize so much of your research through the graphs and the diagrams, and it's really inspiring to see. I have a question, I guess, about how you in your practice sort of decide when a project is over or when to sort of to stop something. I mean, I'm sure there might be some very sort of practical constraints in terms of, say, an exhibition or a grant or something like that, but how do you sort of navigate kind of beginnings and endings and sort of, you know, essentially sort of juggling multiple projects at the same time and moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess the short answer is I don't ever end a project. They just kind of like peter out and then get restarted. So I have not like officially ended any of the projects that you would like see on my website. Like they're still all ongoing. So the graphs, for example, got paused after the election, or no, like more in 2018, because I ended up taking a full-time job and working more directly in online harassment, and sort of wove a little bit out of the general misinformation space. And now my work is sort of bringing me back into that. So I always like revisit, or I'm always revisiting stuff that I've worked on. I think for me, there is a project I'm hoping to finish up in the next year and actually like be done with it and like put a lid on it. And that is this VR film called Dark Patterns that my collaborator and I have been working on for a few years. And that's just because it's a film and we like want it to be kind of done. I think I had originally sort of thought that some of these graphs were more in isolation, and it was really over the past year and a half of talking to people and actually sharing them that I realized that they are very much in concert with each other and they're not these sort of separate things. But part of that was because they were all published for different projects, or they were published for different news organizations. So like my Fusion News work, for example, which is now was called Splintered, then was closed and sort of wrapped into Gizmodo, which was wrapped into something else. That was just like a series of work I had been doing, but I wasn't on staff there. I had a really lovely editor who would say yes to a bunch of work I would propose. But it took me a lot longer than you would think to sort of realize that these were all works that really need to be put together. And so right now I'm working on how can I kind of put all of these things together and where is a place to put that. So I don't know, I hope that was a satisfying answer. A lot of it is just, I'm also still like working through stuff that I've put out there and actually realizing that they're much more related to each other than I initially thought.
Great, we have a question from Kelly.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was curious, in the first half of the talk, you kind of think about your work in relation to dominant ideology coming out of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. And I was just wondering how you think about kind of moving some of the things that you've done into being adopted within the broader industry, if you've had connections with specific people. I guess just from my own observation, it seems like those two worlds, the art world and the tech world, don't tend to have a lot of overlap, and I'm just curious how you've tried to bridge that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just do and I don't. I mean, I think what's well, I mean, there is like all these different movements inside of like tech-based art, right? Like where there's the computational art scene, there's like net art, there is like experimental media art. But I mean, for a long time and even now, like my research work and my artwork has been considered very separate. So like I have a very like sort of rigorous practice as a human rights researcher. And so a lot of my like, I guess it's what you could more closely call my day job, even though art and my human rights work are very equal to me. But a lot of my colleagues, for example, like had no idea that I make art, even though I make art under my name and I tweet about it and they follow me on Twitter. But it's like a lot of that work I find ends up kind of siloing itself in a weird way. Like people are only kind of aware of what's either immediately in front of them or their most immediate interests. And so for me, I for a long time sort of leaned into that natural separation. And now I'm trying to sort of mush them together more in my practice. I have found it harder. And there is like a question here that I'm going to try to answer and sort of weave into this, because I don't traditionally work with, or I do work with technology, but not in a very traditional way, in the sense of like, I'm not, for example, like a UX designer at Google. It would be fine if I was, but I'm not. I run my own design firm. I think it would be a lot harder because I would have my time really constrained and sort of boxed out during the day. And when I was working at IBM Watson, when my research and art career were taking off more, I was lucky that I actually worked remotely and I had a lot of autonomy in my workday. So I could go travel for residencies and just work effectively like a 14-hour or 16-hour day. So I would like clock into work at the residency and then clock out of my day job at like 5 and clock into my 6 to 11, which is what I would call my art practice. And I just kind of did that. And I guess now the work that I do, and this is, I want to touch on Gabriel's question, which is, so I do human rights work, which is what some people would just define as my day job, even though my art practice is also that. So the question that's written here is, in many places where communities are more vulnerable, the artist decides to go in and use art as tools to make interventions. The idea is to help communities in some way, but those communities kick them out, the artists, and reject them. What do you think of this kind of artist mission, or this kind of, I guess, artist style called missionary art? I think of it in a similar way with I guess I think of this under my own practice, which is, I don't think it's helpful for anyone to sort of helicopter into a situation, be it an artist or a researcher or a technology company that is like, I'm gonna help these people figure out what's going on here. So when I advocate for things like a social justice and human rights practice, what I'm advocating actually is that people understand human rights processes, which means working with communities. So if you are a researcher or an artist that's interested, let's say in like facial recognition and police surveillance, there are many, many human rights groups and activist groups and community groups working on that. So if you want to go in and help, are you the person first to be helping or to be unpacking this? What can you offer? And can you move at the speed of human rights, which is actually like listening to the community on the ground, which are the experts, and can you support them? You're there to support their work, and if they reject you, that's fine, then you're not supposed to be working there anymore. So like the way that like a human rights structure would function more is actually going in and supporting groups that are there. So like some work I'm doing with the Carter Center, that's Jimmy Carter's nonprofit, is helping them prepare to start doing large scale online harassment research work and looking at harassment that female politicians face online. So I'm helping them do is create a series of briefs and training tools, and then a series of questions and tools they need to build to then go partner with local activist groups in different countries that are maybe looking at gender and violence on the internet. So that wouldn't be the job of the Carter Center to go in, for example, Myanmar, and say like, we're gonna study harassment that female politicians in Myanmar face. Like there's already a group doing that. But what the Carter Center can do is partner with them and say, well, we have money and technology support, and what we can do is also sort of use our platform as this nonprofit to like share these findings. And we have budget to then like pay your staff to like run these like research reports. Do you wanna partner with us? So I think it's always important to sort of lead with that, which is understanding that even if you have an idea, that you may not be the one to actually fully execute that idea, or you may not be the person that should be in charge of the idea. Maybe the best thing you can do actually is just be a supportive helper. And this is also kind of where I see my work as an artist and a researcher sort of coming together is my human rights practice deeply informs how I approach working with people as an artist. And it also makes me deeply question, when I'm interested in something, should I be the person looking at it or not? And if not, but I'm interested in it, can I convince someone to host a panel, and can I help them research who should be giving the talk? Could I be the moderator or something? Can I be helpful in sort of bringing tangentially something into the world? But it's recognizing where maybe it's not my place to actually be in charge of that. That's the way that I think of it. I think it's totally fine if communities don't want to work with artists. Maybe artists should be more mindful of the communities they helicopter into.
Great. We have a question from Artemis Willis. Hello, and thanks for this presentation. My question has to do with historical precedent. Does your work draw on any longer traditions, older forms of data visualization, for example? I am specifically thinking about Charles Joseph Minard's 1869 map of Napoleon's march, which depicts the losses suffered in the 1812 Russian campaign.
Thank you so much for that question. My work looks at like, well, I don't formally look at like older or longer forms of like data visualization in terms of informing my work, but when I am researching a subject, I try to go really, really far back in time when looking at it to try to understand how any kind of like, any kind of systemic inequality will have effects now. So for example, I was working on a project as a writer in residence with Google Pair, and that's the People in Artificial Intelligence group at Google. And they were really interested in us thinking about what is like the future of AI in cities, and like what were problems that AI could solve, not at all involving humans. And so we decided to look at this initiative in New York called the A Million Trees Project, where New York State wanted to plant 1 million trees. And I promise this anecdote has a point to it. But when you start to look at like where trees are planted and how well they live or not, you can't just look at like the year it was planted. You have to go really far back in time to try to understand like how structural decisions made in the city can affect where we are now, meaning like the history of redlining and gentrification. So like if trees aren't growing at the same rate in different parts of the city, it's just, you need to have like this sort of historical purview of, well, how has racism affected how the city of New York allocates resources to different parts of the city? And also like, how have neighborhoods maybe changed over the past few decades, and how could that relate to different, how could that relate to soil quality, for example? So how has the Bronx been changed by redlining or gentrification? The New York City decided to build an entire highway through it. Well, what does a highway do to a neighborhood? Causes all different kinds of disruption, like pollution to like noise pollution. How can that affect how trees grow? Well, it would have some effect. And so the reason I bring this up is when I approach looking at different problems or research, I think it's always important to sort of go way further back in time and then work my way forward to try to get an understanding and grounding of how, you know, something like a neighborhood changing or shifting can have, from 100 years ago, can have effects on that neighborhood even still now today. So that's the kind of historical analysis I usually pull from.
Great. Amber has a question.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question. You mentioned that your research can take like several outcomes, right? Like it doesn't matter. But I was wondering, how do you decide what form your research should ultimately take, and like why?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. No one's ever asked me that before, actually. So I really appreciate that. I hope this is a satisfying answer. It really just, it has to like speak to me in a way. My introduction into art was first through music and then through photography. And so, and then from photography to like moving video, then to large format photography, then back to digital photography. And so for me, it really just, as I'm like looking at something and looking at something and looking at something, it starts to sort of speak to me like what form it should take. So like, for example, a collaborator reached out to me, a brand new collaborator, and he thought I was more of like a traditional data visualizer. So he was like, I want to make like network maps. I'm like, that's great. Like, let's talk about it. And he's like, can you make them? And I'm like, oh, I can, but I'm not a data visualizer. And as he was describing the problem to me, and I was reading over his notes, I realized, and what he wanted was, he's like, I just want really beautiful like graphics. I want them to be like aesthetically arresting. And I'm like, oh, that's great that you know what you want. But as I was reading through his work, I was like, I think actually what you need is like interactive graphs that like layer on top of each other, or like an animation. What you need, because there's so much data here, it can't actually be contained into one thing. You need to first ground people in like the big picture. So like, what is the biggest, most zoomed out data set? If you're dealing with like 1,000 people, but 200 micro groups in the 1,000 people, maybe the first thing you should do is find like what are the most minimal but biggest problems, and then like zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. And then through this way, you can then explain the data. So for me, it is just, this is an example. It's really sitting with something and looking at it and trying to figure out all the like twists and turns. And I really spent a lot of time like mentally rolling stuff over in my head. So I spend a lot of time actually sort of sitting and thinking and like really visualizing like what I'm working on, what are the problems. I actually like talk to myself a lot. Like I'll be walking and I'll just listen to music and I'll start like talking to myself to like work out a problem that I'm stuck on. So I spend a lot of time just sitting and thinking about the same thing over and over and over again. And then usually through that, I start to figure out actually like this is where like the thorniness is, this is where like this complexity is. And then how would I explain that to someone? And like what are the tools I would need almost to like lay out my case of explaining to someone? And then through that thought process, that's when I'm like, oh, it needs to be these different things. So the trolling taxonomy, for example, was I've never like shared this publicly before, but I had gotten into like an argument with someone, like a Gamergator on Twitter. They had like found my Twitter account and they were trying to say that like Gamergate isn't harassment. And we got into this Twitter argument. Luckily they didn't harass me, but I was like, this is harassment. They're like, no, it's trolling. And so I ended up actually making that taxonomy to be like, let me show you explicitly how your actions are harassment. And then I really started to map it out. But at that point, I had also already constructed an argument from other conversations with other people on how like trolling and harassment are not the same thing, but they're used interchangeably. But at first, the taxonomy was actually like a flat graph. And it was me like sitting with it and then actually getting feedback from a friend that it shifted completely into the matrix that you see. So yeah, a lot of it is just me thinking and like talking through an idea. And then there's usually this moment where I'm like, oh, it has to sort of look like this. And then I keep playing with it and playing with it more and more.
Great. Cindy, you had a question.
It was more of a, I just kind of wanted to know where the living wage Turk might go. I love that provocation, especially since we're using it right now, both via, well, there's like a usertesting.com site and Mechanical Turk and Craigslist all give like, you know, some small payment for work done. And I think that would be really interesting to work with them even and just say, you know, like how, is this something that people do on a regular basis? And is there a way to kind of approximate how much money somebody's income is made up of doing things like that?
Totally. So the way I do CTRK is related to the feminist data set, like very, very explicitly, because at some point I'm going to need to like structure and train this data model. And like the fastest way to do that would be just putting it on Mechanical Turk and asking people to like label text or label images. So for me, I spent a lot of time. So I spend like at every step of trying to generate this feminist chatbot, I spent a lot of time focused on each step of like, well, what does this mean? Well, what is the feminist intervention? Like, can I really use Amazon, like an Amazon tool? And like, what are the drawbacks to me using this? So TRK pulled from a lot of different research. Like I was reading a lot of Lily Irani's papers. I was reading a lot of articles on Mechanical Turk. I've already done Mechanical Turk style like data analysis before on different projects. So I knew kind of like what it feels like to train and label data. But it is more of a provocation. So it's focused on the area of Seattle, primarily because, so from a Lily Irani paper, the two largest groups of Mechanical Turkers are in the US and India. And so I knew that like I didn't have enough time or money to create like a living API where I could be pulling in from different countries, like what their minimum wage is. And after actually having tried to research that, a lot of that information doesn't get like updated very, like not frequently. So I would have to like build and maintain like an API to just generate basic information around a minimum wage. And then to figure out a living wage, some newspapers will do that. The resources become out of date pretty quickly. So I focused on the US because I knew I would have an easier time. And it was also like the second largest group of Mechanical Turkers. I wouldn't have picked them if it hadn't been. But I also knew I'd have an easier time finding information about a living wage just because of income disparity in the United States. And that is like a major topic of like rising rents without a lot of renter caps. And so I had a hunch that that would be information I could probably find in most states. So then to try to look, so I then tried to co-locate, well, which city or state should I focus on? Because there isn't like, again, this large database. There wasn't a large database of like all the states' minimum wages and then living wages created. So for time and elegance, I needed to pick one place. So I looked at, well, what are all the states with like the highest and lowest minimum wage? And it turned out Washington State, where Amazon is headquartered, actually has the highest minimum wage in the United States at $11 an hour. And then from there, it was pretty easy to pinpoint, well, what would be the city with the highest living wage? And that would be Seattle, because it's like the most populated city in Washington State. And then also Amazon is located right outside of Seattle and then also in Seattle. So then Seattle's living wage is around like, I think $16 or $19 an hour. And then from there, I just worked backwards in terms of then trying to generate, well, what would a living wage look like? So the thing to keep in mind actually with Mechanical Turk and with any kind of task-based service is you are not paid per hour, you're paid per task. So like in the ways in which you could be hired as some freelancer jobs, you would maybe be paid per hour, but in a lot of spaces you're paid per task. So if someone says, hey, like I'm going to give you $30 to transcribe this recording, if the recording is 30 minutes long and it takes you an hour, that seems like a pretty good deal. But if the recording is like 2 hours long and it takes you like 5 hours to transcribe it, that's not a good deal, right? So with being paid per task, not being paid per time, it actually really shifts the relationship towards money and trying to unpack what it is. And that was one thing I noticed inside of Mechanical Turk, is that there was never this equation of time, of how long do you think it's going to take someone to do this? Because suddenly saying I'm going to pay you 10 cents to label this image, there's a lot of stuff in the image that may take a long time. And so if it takes you like a minute to label the image, can you really quickly limit or can you really quickly, label 60 images, right, in 1 hour? That's also a crazy amount of stamina to have to be doing a task, like actively, because every image looks different, right? Every sentence will look different. So the way that I tried to unpack it then was thinking around, okay, like how long would it take to do some tasks and how can I kind of craft a baseline? So I timed myself doing different tasks, gave myself just this limit of like 20 seconds, because some tasks are pretty easy and some aren't. And then I started from there of looking at how long would this take. Another thing that we included in the wage calculator, and this is something I pulled from working at the Wikimedia Foundation, is also when you're doing Mechanical Turk style tasks, you're chained to your computer. So if you get up to take a break, and this is similar, I think, in doing Uber or TaskRabbit work, you're not paid for the time you take a break. Wikimedia, when I worked there, was a remote workplace. So we instituted 55-minute meetings. So everyone had a built-in 5-minute break to go get water, to go to the bathroom, to do like whatever they needed to do, to check their email. So we built that into the calculation, and we built in a 45-minute lunch break. So then the way the calculator actually works is saying, like, for someone to hit a living wage in Seattle, and instead of working an 8-hour day, they're actually working naturally a 6.5-hour day, of which they should be entitled to because they should have bathroom breaks that they're paid for, and also a lunch break. People actually need to make, I think it was more like $21 an hour. I think it's like $16 an hour is a living wage, and 19.5 is what we came up with as the actual working wage. So then all the tasks are related to that. So when you start to play with the calculator, it's trying to get you above this certain amount.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Caroline. That was wonderful work. And thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to everyone who was a participant and watched this show. Next week, we have Noni de la Pena, same time, and hope to see you there. Okay, thank you.